like the problem with Johnston and the other theories is that they all start with a suspect being plucked out of the air and evidence being framed around him. Tonight, we intend to do the reverse, to start with the evidence and see which suspect this leads us to. Our starting point is to re-examine who the police at the time thought the Ripper was, because if they didn't know his identity, no one ever did or will. In 1910, a book was published called The Lighter Side of My Official Life. It was the autobiography of Sir Robert Anderson, a former Assistant Commissioner of the CID at the time of the Ripper murders. I've been joined by Paul Begg, an author and historian. Paul, what do we know about Sir Robert?
Before Sir Robert had been appointed the Assistant Commissioner, the head of the CID, he'd worked for the Home Office as an advisor on the Irish question. In fact, he'd been a spy master. He'd been what today we would describe as the control of a spy called Henry Le Caron, who'd infiltrated the Fenian Brotherhood movement in the United States and was feeding information back to Britain. In the course of his career, Anderson came into contact with many state secrets. Unfortunately, he liked to reveal a few of these, or from our point of view, fortunately. And he reveals 2 or 3 in his book. When we can test his claims, they always prove to be true. There is therefore no reason to disbelieve what Anderson has to say about the Ripper.
So he's a senior police officer, a former intelligence officer, and we can cross-reference his claims. They've proved to be true.
That's right.
Makes him sound a useful witness for us then. And in fact, Anderson tantalizes us with a passage in the book about the Ripper. He says, undiscovered murders are rare in London, and the Jack the Ripper crimes are not within that category. Having regard to the interest attaching to the case, I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course, and the traditions of my old department would suffer. I will merely add that the only person who ever saw the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. But he refused to give evidence against him. In saying he was a Polish Jew, I am merely stating a definitely ascertained fact.
This is what Macnaghten wrote.
I may mention the cases of 3 men, any of whom would have been more likely than Cutbush to have committed this series of murders. First, Mr. M.J. Druitt, said to have been a doctor and of good family, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder, and whose body, which was said to have been upwards of a month in the water, was found in the Thames on December the 31st. That is, 7 weeks after that murder. He was sexually insane. And from private information, I have little doubt but that his own family believed him to have been the murderer. Second, Kosminski, a Polish Jew and a resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. There were many circumstances connected with this man which made him a strong suspect. Third, Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor and a convict who was subsequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. The man's antecedents were of the worst possible type, and his whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained.
Remind us what Anderson actually wrote.
Anderson writes, "I will merely add that the only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him, but he refused to give evidence against him."
What also is exciting, of course, is that your grandfather's written some notes in the book.
Yes, he wrote just below that as follows: "Because the suspect was also a Jew, and because his evidence would convict the suspect, and witness would be the means of the murderer being hanged, which he did not wish to be left on his mind."
I see there's a second note in the margin here.
My grandfather's written in the margin, "And after this identification, which the suspect knew, no other murder of this kind took place in London."
So it's very dramatic stuff, isn't it?
It is, yes, it is.
Thank you, Jim. Chief Inspector Swanson says the witness did not want to testify against a fellow Jew. But this book has one more secret to reveal. On the end paper, Swanson writes, and I quote, continuing from page 138, after the suspect had been identified at the seaside home, where he had been sent by us with difficulty in order to subject him to identification, and he knew he was identified. On suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by police, city CID, by day and night. In a very short time, the suspect, with his hands tied behind his back, he was sent to Stepney Workhouse and then to Colney Hatch and died shortly afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect, and like the other notes, it's initialed DSS. So Kosminski was Anderson's suspect, not John Pizer. Have we found Jack the Ripper?
The evidence does seem to be pointing to Kosminski. We've got three senior officers of the period, Anderson with his book, McNaughton with his memo, and now Swanson with the marginalia, all seemingly implicating the same man. The next step is to test what these three men are telling us. Who was Kosminski? What can we find out about him? What brought him to the police's attention? Well, Swanson told us he was sent to Colney Hatch Mental Asylum. If he's right, there must be a reference to Kosminski in the asylum records.
I'm at the Greater London Archives, and this is the Colney Hatch Asylum Admissions Register from November 1888 to December 1906. As we look through the index, we can actually find our man, and here he is, Aaron Kosminski. Swanson was right. I'm with the crime historian, Martin Fido. Martin, you first discovered Kosminski's entry in this register. Can you tell us what it says?
Yes, it says here, Aaron Kosminski, date of admission 7th of February 1891, age 26, occupation hairdresser, civil state single, religion Hebrew, education can read and write, time of insanity 6 years, cause of mental condition self-abuse, form of disorder mania, symptoms incoherence, bodily state fair, and he is discharged on April the 19th, 1894.
What does it tell us about his mental state?
Nothing. For that, we need this book, which is the day book of Colney Hatch Asylum with his full medical notes. Now, the doctor who committed him, Dr. Huchin, writes, he declares that he is guided and his movements altogether controlled by an instinct that informs his mind. He says he knows the movements of all mankind, he refuses food from others because he's told to do so, and he eats out of the gutter for the same reason. And another witness, Jacob Cohen of 51 Carter Lane, St. Paul's, EC, says that Kosminski goes about the streets and picks up bit of bread out of the gutter and eats them. He drinks water from the tap and he refuses food at the hands of others. He took up a knife and threatened the life of his sister. He says that he is ill and his cure consists in refusing food. He is melancholic. He practices self-abuse. He's very dirty and will not be washed. He has not attempted any kind of work for years.
I find the bit about the knife interesting. What else do the notes tell us?
Well, the knife bit, yes, I'll repeat that. It says he took up a knife and threatened the life of his sister. There's not much violence after that. He's mostly apathetic and melancholic. But on January the 9th, 1892, they note that he's at times excited and violent. A few days ago, he took up a chair and attempted to strike the charge attendant.
You mentioned earlier that Kosminski was discharged from Colney Hatch in 1894. What happened to him after that?
He was a burnt-out imbecile. They sent him on to Leavesden Asylum for Imbeciles, where ultimately he died of gangrene of the leg.
Even though it's been more than 100 years since the Ripper committed his crimes, there is still one modern investigative science that can be applied to the case. It's called psychological offender profiling. This technique should give us a psychological blueprint for the Ripper. We can see if Kosminski bears up to this in any way. In fact, we've been joined by Professor David Cantor from the University of Surrey, who's been given a dossier on the Ripper crimes. Now, David, you work with the police on serious crimes today. These crimes were committed more than 100 years ago. Did the information we give you help in any way?
Well, I was surprised how detailed the information was. I mean, in some cases, there's more detail there than the material we get today from the police. But of course, there are important gaps. We don't know what actually happened in the crime because we don't have the forensic material that we would have today.
Can we tell anything, David, from when the murders happened?
Well, they're all committed around the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, as I understand it, that helps to suggest that he does have some sort of occupation during the week. So there's something very curious about thinking it back into those times, because it's not a 5-day week as it is now, where Saturday, Sunday would be regarded as the weekend. People presumably work 6, if not 7 days, and it's quite intriguing that it's a Friday and a Saturday and a Sunday that are the days.
Could that perhaps be a religious connotation there? I mean, could it be, say, something to do with the fact that we think the suspect was Jewish?
Well, that's a very interesting possibility. That sort of, one can see when you mention that, that fits in.
That with Friday evenings the Sabbath would start and perhaps he would be not working, or...
That sort of thing would certainly make sense.
The Ripper strikes next in Berners Street, 2 weeks after the murder of Annie Chapman. At 12:45 a.m. on September the 30th, 1888, Israel Schwartz, a Jew living in Whitechapel, was in Berners Street. According to Home Office files, he saw a man and a woman called Liz Stride at the gateway to the courtyard. He saw a struggle on the pavement, and Liz Stride was thrown to the ground. Just 15 minutes later, Louis Dimeschutz was returning home from his work as a seller of cheap jewellery to the working men's club he was running with his wife. As he pulled into the courtyard, passing the gates where Schwartz had seen the man arguing with Liz Stride, his horse was startled and hesitated. Dimeschutz saw the body of a woman lying on the ground and believed it was his wife, drunk. He left her to sleep it off. Finding his wife in the club, he returned for a closer look at the body and found that the woman was dead. It was Liz Stride. She'd been murdered. In her left hand, she still grasped tissue paper containing cashew nuts, and a sprig of flowers on her clothing was undamaged. It's possible that Dimeschutz's horse was startled by the Ripper himself, hiding in the shadows. Like the other victims, Liz Stride's throat had been cut from left to right, but this time the cut was only light. Was the Ripper disturbed before he could complete his ghastly ritual? It's quite possible he was, because he went on to murder his fourth victim here in Mitre Square 45 minutes later. On this occasion, he had enough time to leave his chilling hallmarks on the body of the victim, Catherine Eddowes. But there was also a Jewish witness involved in the Mitre Square murder, and we must consider whether it could have been him and not Schwartz who identified Anderson's suspect as Jack the Ripper. On the night of her murder, Catherine Eddowes is released from Bishopsgate Police Station by PC George Hutt. 43-year-old Eddowes had been drunk and was kept in the cell until 1 a.m. when she'd managed to sober up. She heads off in the direction of Mitre Square, which is about 8 minutes' walk away. At 1:30 a.m., PC Edward Watkins passes through Mitre Square on his beat. Everything is normal. At 1:35 a.m., Joseph Lavender, a commercial traveller, notices a man talking to Catherine Eddowes near a passage leading to Mitre Square. The man's description matches that of the one Schwartz saw earlier that night with Liz Stride. He has a cloth cap on with a peak of the same material. If the man with Liz Stride was not the killer, she must have been attacked by two different men on separate occasions on exactly the same spot in just 15 minutes, which is extremely unlikely.
No photograph survives, but it is possible to do an artist's impression of Aaron Kosminski, drawn from the existing description given to the police by Israel Schwartz. This is what he looked like. He was 5 feet 5 inches tall, broad-shouldered, with a full face and dark hair, a fair complexion, and a small brown moustache. He wore dark clothing and a black, peaked cap. You are almost certainly looking at Jack the Ripper.
In my opinion, Aaron Kosminski, a pauper and schizophrenic, was the suspect. He is unglamorous, perhaps a disappointing Jack the Ripper, certainly not as exciting as royalty, surgeons, barristers and so on. But that is what is so real about him, what makes him seem so infinitely more probable. Just add the evidence up. Kosminski was seen attacking one of the victims, Liz Stride, just minutes before her murder. The witness, Israel Schwartz, identified him to police, although he subsequently refused to testify against him. Finally, senior officers who worked on the case believed Kosminski was definitely their man. More than 100 years on, this is probably as close as we'll come.